Welcome to UO Today. I'm Barbara Altman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Myriam Chancy, a professor of English at the University of Cincinnati, where she teaches African diaspora studies, Caribbean literature, post-colonial literature and theory, feminist theory and women's studies, and creative writing. Chancy, a Haitian-Canadian writer born in Port-au-Prince in Haiti, is an award-winning author of several academic and creative books. Her work, Framing Silence, Revolutionary Novels by Haitian Women from 1997, was instrumental in inaugurating Haitian women's studies as a field of specialization. Searching for Safe Spaces, Afro-Caribbean Women Writers in Exile, also from 1997, earned the Outstanding Academic Book Award by Choice, the Journal of the American Library Association. Chancy's first novel, Spirit of Haiti from 2003, was a Commonwealth Prize finalist. Her second novel, The Scorpion's Claw, 2005, is currently taught at universities and colleges throughout the U.S. and Canada. Her latest novel from 2010 is titled The Loneliness of Angels. Chancy gave a talk titled Submission or Omission, Haiti's Challenge in Latin America on April 14th as the 2011 Bartolomé de las Casas Lecturer in Latin American Studies at the University of Oregon. Myriam, thanks for talking to us.
Thank you for having me, Barbara.
It's really great that you were willing to take the time to do this because this will get to a lot of people who won't have been able to attend your lecture. So
okay.
This is it's wonderful that you took the time. You have a complicated or at least multifaceted identity. Mm-hmm. You identify as Haitian-Canadian, but you're living and working here in the States.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about your consciousness of being a person with multiple different aspects to her background?
Yes, absolutely. I guess I would say that in print I would identify as Haitian-Canadian so that especially readers in the United States can realize that I'm not Haitian-American and that adds a different sort of aspect to the writing that I do and the perspectives that I bring to it. In terms of my own self-identity, I consider myself Haitian first and culturally Haitian, partly because I was raised in that way, but also because I think in Canada there isn't a sort of assimilation. We don't have to assimilate and be Canadian in the way that I think immigrants who come to the United States have to find ways to assimilate and become American. At least at the time when I grew up, everyone that I knew of European background, of other backgrounds, identified with their family's culture and usually had another first language. And so the idea that you could just be what you were in terms of your family or where you were born was very strong. So I could identify as Haitian without it being problematic. And also in my family, we went back and forth between Haiti and Canada from the time I was born until I was about 8 or 10. And so I didn't, as a child, have a consciousness of being Canadian, even as my citizenship was being changed by my parents. So for me, I was living in Haiti, going to school in Canada, even though by the time I was school age, it was probably the other way around. So I really had no idea that I was Canadian. So over time, especially coming to the States to do my PhD and then staying here to work, I really became more Canadian identified because I realized that a great part of how I thought about the world was formed by that childhood in Canada, my education, the Canadian context, which I think was very rich, especially living in the prairies. We started out in Quebec City, and then we moved to Winnipeg, Manitoba. And Winnipeg, at the time that I grew up, was considered the most multicultural city in Canada. And I can see now that there are great benefits to that. And so that's generally how I see myself and the context in which I circulate.
It's so interesting for me to hear you explain that because it's completely consistent with my own experience as the child of immigrants to Canada. So I'm also a hyphenated Canadian, and what you say is very much the same as my experience growing up there as a child with a very different culture that was very much part of my identity.
Right.
Do you find that you end up explaining this a lot here in the U.S.?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I've lived in every part of the U.S. except the Northwest, so it's interesting for me to visit Oregon at this time. And so I've found that in almost every region of the United States, even today we still have a lot of polarization around race. And so I find that often people assume that I must be African American because I'm of African descent. I speak a fluent English, and so there isn't an accent that they can identify as coming from another background, even though French is my first language. And so I find that often I have to explain first that I'm Haitian, Francophone, then that I'm Canadian, and you usually don't say A, so it's not obvious that I'm Canadian. It slips out once in a while, but so people really have a difficult time understanding what that might mean. And I'm also multiracial and multi-ethnic, and in the Haitian context, or coming from the Caribbean, it's very normative to have multiple racial or ethnic parts of your background and be able to be sort of fluid with it, that you don't necessarily overly identify with one aspect of your ethnicity or another, which I don't think is the case in the United States, that there really is a sense in which people seem to have to choose which background they're going to identify with and circulate with in the society. And so I think there are pluses and minuses to that. Even as a teacher, I find that allows me to open up different doors for students to think more flexibly around racial issues, ethnic issues, class issues, all kinds of issues. But at the same time, I think individually for myself, it means that it's often very confusing for other people to encounter me and to situate me, sometimes uncomfortable, So, and actually this connects a little bit to the talk that I'm giving here, which really does talk about Haitian-Dominican relationships. I'm a quarter Dominican, and in the Dominican society there are these polarizations that the United States also has around race. And so I have had the experience of being in the Dominican Republic because to most Dominicans I look quote-unquote Dominican, being very confused by the fact that I identify as Haitian and wondering why would I identify as Haitian if I could identify as Dominican, because being Haitian in that context is not positive. So there are similarities, I think, with the American context.
That's a very complicated cultural package to carry around and explain with you.
Yes.
I wanted to follow up a little bit about your talk here on campus. The title of it includes the words submission or omission.
Right.
Could you talk about that binarity, what you have in mind? Absolutely.
What I really want to focus on or have people explore and think about is where or how Haiti is situated in this hemisphere, but in particular, because this talk is primarily prepared for Latin American studies, in the Latin American or Latin Caribbean context. And there's a lot of conflict, I think, for scholars of Latin America around racialized issues, and how do we think about race in the Latin American context. Haiti in that context is considered the most Africanized country, and that is also conflated with its poverty and in some ways lack of resolution around the revolution. So people can perceive the successful revolution as being a failure because of where we are now, 200 years later.
Let me just ask you to specify, do you mean specifically because Haiti is a poor country, there's some assumption that the revolution was unsuccessful?
Absolutely. I think that there is a lack of understanding of a history that has culminated in Haiti's state today, especially post-earthquake, when we see that there is not a lot of rebuilding going on, that there are not a lot of infrastructures in place to assist people, that the response post-earthquake has not resulted in real progress. And a year and a half almost later, we really see that there hasn't been the kind of rebuilding that we've seen in other parts of the world where earthquakes have been occurring since January 12th of 2010. It's just a completely different story. But even prior to the earthquake, Haiti has been situated as a country that has failed to actualize, its promise. And so there's great pride around the Haitian Revolution. But then when we look at, or people look at the state of Haiti and Haitians in the country, then they say, well, it must be a consequence of their negritude, their Africanity, that they fail to, persist or actualize, as opposed to, in fact, that they were punished for having the temerity to liberate themselves in many different kinds of ways, globally and otherwise, in terms of who had power over this country and its ability to trade, prosper, etc. So submission and omission has to do with the fact that really Haiti has been omitted from the discourse in Latin America, except for in the political sciences, primarily in terms of this idea of its Africanness. So it's other, it's different from us, therefore we can't really include it in a conversation. This is very consistent, especially in literary studies. Haiti's neither really Francophone, it's neither really Anglophone. They don't speak Spanish, even though the Dominican Republic is on the other side and shares a history, and so we're just going to omit it. Submission really has to do with, are we now at a moment in time where Haiti has to capitulate to the stereotypes or discourse around it in order to no longer be omitted? So the question I ask is, are these the only choices that we have in terms of a future for Haiti? Does Haiti, because Haiti, or the response in the Haitian context to that omission has been to be very proud of its heritage, and you see that in the culture, in terms of musical production, in terms of the artistic production, the actual art that people make, the literary production, especially from people who have been in exile since the Duvalier years. So there's a sense in which the response has always been very prideful but productive, but in a sphere that hasn't assisted the country necessarily economically. And so one of the things that people cling to is this idea of sovereignty, right? That we're a sovereign state, we should be proud of that, and we should work out of that particular concept. One of the things I've grappled with, and as a scholar, is whether or not that is an intellectual position that really does not assist those who are in Haiti still struggling to make a go of things, the poorest classes. And out of that class, there has been actually a demand for a kind of inclusion in another state, whether it's the United States, sort of like Puerto Rico, or the French departments of Martinique and Guadeloupe in France, but somehow maybe Haiti should be annexed to a power that can assist it out of its misery. And let's forget the fact that there have been these 200 years of oppression. Maybe we should, quote unquote, submit and separate from this history. Not separate in terms of forgetting about it, but in terms of perhaps relaxing, this stance that sovereignty is the thing that keeps us going. And so I'm really questioning the idea of, is that submission a subjugation, or is it just an acceptance that this is how things are and will deliver us to a better future?
Do you have an answer to your own question?
I do not really have an answer to that question. In the talk, what I do is really try to bring to the surface what the history between Haiti and the Dominican Republic has been, how it's related, how these two countries are related, intricately related, but there's no real difference in terms of the shared aspect of the history of what Haitian and Dominicans have gone through. There are different results from that history in terms of how they've been treated from the land side as opposed to the Franco-American side. But what I try to demonstrate is that the racialization of Haitians has equally hurt Dominicans ideologically. So Haitians actually come out of a situation poorer economically or materially, but much stronger in terms of their identity. And Dominicans come out more prosperous economically, but I think impoverished in terms of their identity, which is oppositional to Haitians. And so what I try to do is to create a bridge out of a history and to try to then look at some of the literature, especially coming out of the Dominican American side, and to see how there has been a shift even generationally, where older Dominican writers were less accepting, less inclusive of the Haitian, and younger Dominican writers starting to actually have a conversation which is more inclusive. And so perhaps I try to get around the question by looking at actually the arts, right, the production in the literary arts, and to say that at least imaginatively there is a space being created for a possibility of union that goes beyond national borders. And so it might not have to result in a question having to do with sovereignty or omission, but a kind of inclusivity that both sides then submit to. So.
Thank you for that little précis. That's great. That leads me to talk a little bit about your stellar career. Your first two scholarly books both appeared when you were still in your 20s.
Yes.
And you very quickly got propelled into the forefront of Haitian studies, and particularly Haitian women's studies.
Right.
At the same time, you're a very successful novelist.
Yes.
And so you have these two different kinds of discourse going.
Yes.
I wanted to talk a little bit more about your most recent novel, The Loneliness of Angels, which appeared in 2010.
Yes.
And first of all, to ask you about the question of distribution.
Mm.
Your work tends to appear in the United Kingdom and in Canada before it appears in the United States.
Right.
Why is that?
That really, I think, has to do with the style in which that I write. British presses have been more open to the way in which I write, which is a kind of a combination of a French lexicon, but it's in English. And my understanding of, because I've been surprised as well by that, I've had more difficulty trying to have American presses interested in the work, and even Canadian presses. But the British presses, of course, publish automatically in the Commonwealth, right, in the UK and Commonwealth. And so the Canadian press or distribution networks then have access to that immediately. But my understanding from my own work in the Anglophone field is that the British presses have an understanding of the ways in which Caribbean writers do things to the English language that are, I suppose, creative, but also, somehow mix, patois or relexify the English in order to come up with a sort of a different space for their characters and for that imaginative landscape. And I think in the American context, although that's beginning to change, there's a lot of resistance to that. I think most writers of my generation who are Caribbean write in a more standardized, I think, American speech, which I think I resist. And so in that sense, it's been a harder sell, for me to appear with American publishers. But I think in the end, what matters is that the work is there and can circulate and has been circulating, and we'll see what happens in the future.
Well, it's certainly getting great critical acclaim. You've been called the up-and-coming grande dame of Haitian literature. You're a young woman to be assuming a title like that.
Yes.
Do you feel like you have any split between your life as a novelist and your life as an academic, or do they integrate pretty well?
I think they integrate fairly well. And the way I think about it, I was actually a creative writer first, actually in the Canadian context, publishing there first, and continued with academia more or less accidentally, and produced the work on Caribbean women's literature more out of a political desire to answer certain questions that had to do with what was going on in the Caribbean context and Haitian context. Framing Silence, in fact, was a response to the 1994 invasion or occupation. There are different words utilized for that of Haiti by the U.S. And I didn't have the language or the history, all the information to answer the questions that arose from colleagues and students. But the creative writing usually then comes out of what I consider an excess. It's sort of those pieces that I can't get into the scholarship, or that are so speculative that you really could not make an argument, learned argument about them. And so I make a lot of notes, side notes, while I write for scholarship, and then I go back and forth between the critical work and the creative work. At this point in time, my creative work is sort of going off in new directions, and it's less seamless with the scholarship. But I feel like I'm always thinking about new questions, and I need to do both at the same time.
So what you're calling the excess spills over into the fictional realm.
Exactly, exactly.
You have been asked before about this wonderful phrase that's from Searching for Safe Spaces, your first book, that in doing that work you were writing yourself into existence. Mm-hmm. And that seems to me to be realized to a large extent in The Loneliness of Angels, so 16 years later, because you've got this book with at least 5 different narrators. Uh-huh. They're in different countries, they're in different time periods, they're bringing all kinds of different cultural capital to their understanding of an interaction with Haiti.
Right.
So it's a kind of a mosaic, and I'm wondering if is still the manifestation of you writing yourself into existence.
Yes, well, I've been asked that question more and more, and it's interesting because I don't think that I think that way at this point. I really did when I was in my early 20s and working on my PhD, and actually there was some resistance to my working on Caribbean women at that time. You know, who would I find? And at the time I was already publishing, and so it was interesting to be asked, well, who are you going to write about? And there are no Caribbean women writers when I actually was one. And so I think at the time I felt I was writing myself into existence. And perhaps it's still true, going back to, you know, one of your initial questions in terms of how do I circulate in the American context, having all these multiple identities, is that in a sense in the work there's a confirmation that someone like me does exist, and that there are many people like me, not just coming out of a Haitian context, but other contexts where we are part of a number of different cultures and live in them in simultaneity. Another question I was trying to answer with that novel was a question of spirituality. One of the things I think is true in terms of themes across Caribbean literatures is the fact that there's a kind of a confrontation with conflict. You know, the idea that the Caribbean was formed out of conflict, that people reside in conflict, and my own familial experience is very different. And so I wanted to explore in a novel the idea that perhaps the reason why we have so many different ethnicities still residing in the Caribbean and forming family units is that people stayed because they had something in common. And what they had in common was something that across time really refracted in terms of their spirituality, not their religion, you know, not because they were Catholic, but because beneath all of those you know, surface appearances of identity, there was something much deeper, integrally human, which came out of a sort of spiritual consciousness that kept them united. And so I wanted to explore that in the novel. And so in that sense, I think I'm perhaps writing myself less and writing culture, trying to, you know, make visible aspects of a culture that people think perhaps doesn't exist.
I noticed that very strongly about weaving strains of spirituality into the core of that novel.
Yes.
And in fact, just looking at your acknowledgments and notes at the end of the book, you talk about the process of writing the book being something like the Christian labyrinth and walking the labyrinth in various different places.
That's right.
But you also, the very last thing you say in those notes is that you are grateful to the, and you have to help me with the pronunciation here, it's the Loas?
Yes.
Yes, which is L-O-A-S, correct?
Yes.
And that word, if I understand you correctly, it's the spirits of voodoo?
Yes.
Is that correct?
That's right, the pantheon of the gods in Haitian voodoo.
And then you pick that out in the title on the cover of the book by highlighting in a different color the L-O-A-S in the title.
Yes.
So from labyrinth, Christian labyrinth, to voodoo, pantheon of spirits, there's a deep, deep wellspring of spirituality behind this.
Absolutely, yes. And it's interesting that you point that out because actually it was my father who pointed out that the novel's title was an acronym. You know, Loneliness of Angels, L-O-A. The editors decided to focus on the plural, L-O-A-S.
But you had not planned it that way? It was your father who pointed out that it was...
Yes, I was oblivious, you know. And often that happens when you write fiction, is that you have certain things in mind, and other people read, you know, your work and say, yeah, you know, yeah, he pointed that out. And I thought, oh, that's true. You know, the gods are here. So I think that yes, I mean, I walked the labyrinth a great deal for many years in different parts of the world. I think the first labyrinth I walked was in Ireland, and there is that connection in the novel with Ireland. And so I really started exploring mysticism across different cultures and found that some of the aspects of voodoo that people are unfamiliar with are exactly the same in Celtic mysticism and Jewish Kabbalah. Exactly the same. And I just thought that was fascinating. And so I started sort of piecing those things together with the characters. But one of the things I'm very clear about not doing in all of my fiction is that I normally never talk directly about voodoo or name voodoo because of the stereotypes associated with it. And I try to thread it through. And this is, in that title or the acronym, is perhaps the first time and then in that acknowledgement that I have a very clear connection to Vodou as an underpinning of what I'm trying to do, but an indirect one. So,
we don't have a whole lot of time left, but I have to ask you this question quickly. There's a quite a marvelous, in the sense of being astonished at it, prescience about that book, and particularly it's surprising given the fact that you write about an empath, a very intuitive woman, a seer,
right.
And then you publish this book almost simultaneously with that devastating earthquake.
Right.
In retrospect, and I've given you all of about 2 minutes to answer this question,
Yeah.
do you see it as having been connected in some greater scheme of things to the upcoming disaster?
No, not in the sense that I could have predicted that at all, but interestingly, the novel's premise is that there are things beyond our control that span different time periods that guide us along our way. And so if the coda to the novel actually uses a lot of language, and it was pointed out to me after, which is directly related to this idea of the substructure of the earth and eruptions, and they were just metaphors at the time. And the book itself was a response to the 2004 floods and devastations at the time. And so I was really responding to and writing after what at the time has seemed like a horrible event. And the novel was actually supposed to be published in 2009 and was delayed for 6 months. And so they had planned to publish it in February of 2010, and it was just completely accidental. And then I did do some fundraisers and talks, and was able to see that there were these aspects of a novel that I could read from that could really connect to people, especially with Haitians who were outside of Haiti, because there is one character who is the main character actually is outside of Haiti and sees on her television screen what happened in 2004 and reacts, to that. And so I was able to bring that to different forums, and it was very useful in creating a conversation around the fact that even though the earthquake is the most devastating thing that has ever happened to Haiti and to Haitians, that we have lived through other periods that are very similar and have had very similar experiences. And so in particular for Haitians, there's a kind of accumulation of disasters and really trying to put those things together. So I think the novel can still do that work even though it doesn't directly respond to 2010.
That's a great place to end, and I'm sorry to say we're out of time, but I invite readers to look at The Loneliness of Angels, and I can see it's given you a perfect bridge to talk about the process of recovery in Haiti.
Right.
Thank you for being here, Myriam.
Thank you for having me.
We've been speaking with Myriam Chancy, a professor of English at the University of Cincinnati, where she teaches African diaspora studies, Caribbean literature, post-colonial literature and theory, feminist theory and women's studies, and creative writing. Chancy gave a talk titled Submission or Omission, Haiti's Challenge in Latin America on April 14th as the 2011 Bartolomé de las Casas Lecturer in Latin American Studies at the University of Oregon. Thank you for watching and see you next time.